Columbus man admits to strangling pregnant girlfriend, killing her and unborn child. Welcome to Behind the Crime, where true crime meets real life. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Let's uncover the truth, one case at a time. Now let's see today's story. On the night of June 16, 2024, a tense silence fell inside a modest home on Parkwick Drive in Columbus, Ohio. Minutes earlier, raised voices had rattled the walls. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, the kind of argument that comes with an edge of danger, an edge sharpened by history. In the house, 19-year-old Brooke Devinney and her boyfriend, 24-year-old Devon Blair, were locked in yet another confrontation. This time, Brooke's brother and sister-in-law, listening anxiously from another room, felt the urgency press down on them. They reached for their phones and texted 911. They knew what had happened before. They knew Brooke was not safe. And yet, what followed was worse than anyone had dared imagine. The argument escalated, then fell abruptly quiet. The silence was worse than the shouting. Brooke's family members waited, hearts pounding, for the police to arrive. They later told investigators they saw Blair pacing restlessly, moving through the house with a kind of nervous energy, then slipping out through the garage. By the time police arrived, Brooke lay unresponsive. Within hours, she and her unborn son, whom she had already named Aiden, were gone. Police pursued Blair through the neighborhood. He ran across backyards, leapt fences, and finally hid in the shadows near a vacant house. Officers found him hours later, his flight cut short by the inevitability of the crime he had just committed. When he was taken into custody, the community did not yet know the full story of what had happened inside that bedroom. But for those closest to Brooke, the tragedy felt both shocking and horribly familiar. Brooke Devinney was just 19 years old. Friends remembered her as bright, soft-spoken, and eager to begin the next chapter of her life. She had been excited about motherhood. She had chosen a name for her son, Aiden, and spoken of him with hope, as though naming him would summon him closer to the world. Family members later told prosecutors she had dreamed of building stability for herself and her baby. That dream was extinguished in the silence of that June night. The autopsy report would later confirm the brutality of what she endured. Brooke suffered a traumatic brain injury and a deep laceration to her scalp. Her face and neck bore abrasions consistent with strangulation, and her arm carried a bite mark. Forensic investigators pieced together a picture of violence that had been escalating for months, perhaps years. Devon Blair's temper was no secret. Court records showed a long history of domestic violence complaints tied to his name. Brooke herself had reached out for help multiple times. Her parents, her brother, even her neighbors had all called the police at different points, reporting Blair's threats and violent outbursts. In one chilling report, Blair allegedly pressed a knife to Brooke's throat and told her, "I'll kill you." On another occasion, he threatened to bash in her head. Each time, the cycle continued. Police intervention, temporary separation, then reconciliation. Advocates for domestic violence victims say this pattern is tragically common, an exhausting cycle of fear, hope, and escalation. For Brooke, every return seemed to come with the hope that things might change, that Blair might temper his anger, that the promise of a family might outweigh the danger. But violence has a way of accelerating, and in Brooke's case, it reached its breaking point that June night. The day of her death began like so many others, with tension simmering beneath the surface. Brooke's brother and sister-in-law later testified that the couple argued for more than an hour inside her bedroom. The words were muffled, but the anger was unmistakable. Then, at some point, the shouting stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was a warning. Blair's arrest marked only the beginning of the community's reckoning. In his first court appearance, conducted via video in June 2024, Blair displayed the same volatility that had marked his private life. He shouted obscenities at the judge, his contempt for authority laid bare before the courtroom. To observers, it was a disturbing glimpse into the rage that had claimed Brooke's life. It also set the tone for what prosecutors would later argue, that Blair was a man consumed by violence, incapable of controlling his impulses. Over the following months, the legal process unfolded. Blair faced charges that included strangulation, 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter, and multiple counts of felonious assault. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Witness testimony, forensic reports, and the long history of domestic violence calls painted a picture that could not be refuted. Eventually, Blair entered a guilty plea. The courtroom fell silent as the judge handed down his sentence. 46 to 51.5 years in prison, with an additional 2 years added for a previous domestic violence case in which he assaulted deputies by spitting on them. The sentence was not just a measure of punishment but a statement. The court acknowledged that 2 lives had been lost that night, Brooke's and Aiden's. She planned to name the child Aiden, prosecutors said, their words carrying both weight and sorrow. For Brooke's family, it was a small measure of justice, though nothing could fill the void left behind. What lingered after the trial was not just grief but a pressing question. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Records showed that Brooke and her family had called for help numerous times. Police reports documented threats and violence, yet Blair was still free to enter her home, to argue, to escalate. Critics of the system argue that domestic violence cases often fall into a gray area, with victims caught between fear of further violence and the hope for change. Protective orders can be issued, arrests can be made, but the cycle is difficult to break without sustained intervention. In the aftermath, domestic violence advocates in Columbus used Brooke's story as a call to action. They argued for more resources, more education, more immediate consequences for abusers who demonstrate patterns of escalation. Brooke's death, they said, was not an isolated tragedy but part of a broader epidemic of intimate partner violence in the United States. The statistics are stark. Nationally, nearly 1 in 3 women report experiencing physical violence by an intimate partner at some point in their lives. For pregnant women, the risks are even higher. Studies show that pregnancy can intensify abuse, as partners react to the added pressure, responsibility, or perceived loss of control. Brooke was 14 weeks pregnant when she died, her body bearing not only the marks of assault but also the promise of life that was stolen before it began. For her family, the loss was devastating. They remembered Brooke not as a statistic but as a daughter, a sister, a friend. In quiet moments, they thought of the baby boy she had already named, imagined his laugh, his first steps, his presence in family photos. That absence, the empty crib, the unused baby clothes, was a wound that could not be healed by any sentence no matter how long. In Columbus, vigils were held. Friends gathered with candles, holding up photographs of Brooke, speaking her name aloud so she would not be forgotten. They spoke too of Aiden, the child who would never be known but who was mourned all the same. Community leaders promised change, though for those closest to Brooke, promises felt hollow in the shadow of what had been lost. The story of Brooke Devinney and Devon Blair is one of love distorted by violence, of warnings unheeded, of a system stretched too thin to intervene effectively. It is also a story of resilience, of a family determined to honor Brooke's memory by speaking out, by demanding better protections for others, by ensuring that her life and her unborn child's life were not lost in silence. As Blair begins his decades-long sentence, the echoes of that June night remain. They linger in the Parkwood Drive home, in the memories of Brooke's family, in the court transcripts, and in the hearts of those who knew her. The silence that followed the shouting that night is the silence that remains now, a reminder of what was taken and of the voices that must be raised so it never happens again. In the end, Brooke's story is not only about tragedy but about the urgent need to break the cycle of domestic violence. It is about the cost of ignoring the warning signs, about the fragility of hope in the face of rage, and about the lives, 2 lives, that ended before they could truly begin. It is a story that will continue to echo in Columbus and beyond, until the silence is finally replaced with change. Thank you for staying through to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel now.